We are finally on Rule 12. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. That's a bit of a clickbait rule name though. A fair bit of the chapter is spent on his daughter's juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and the pain she experienced because of it. Because of my own experiences with a chronic pain condition, the tone of this video is going to be a little bit different than the others. We're still going to talk science where we can, but the snark is going to be toned down. Don't you worry though, the snark will be back for the actual last chapter. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. Last rule, we're there. Almost. The last chapter is the coda, so we're not technically out of the 12 rules forest just yet. One little bit of YouTube channel business. Other YouTubers have mentioned that some of their subscribers were just randomly unsubscribed from their channels, and take a second to see if that happened to you, if you were a subscriber, if you're still subscribed, and if you're not subscribed, how about clicking that button for me? It's free. And a quick refresher on the visual cues for the different word sources. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science. This can be things that Peterson cited or research pertinent to what we're talking about. Okie doke. Let's find out why we should get friendly with street pussy. This chapter about petting cats starts with Peterson talking about the dog he had at the time of writing. Quick spoilers. His daughter, Michaela, at one point talked about the deep grief she felt after losing a dog and how that was different from depression. And I'm gonna guess that with the timing of things, she was talking about this dog. The dog, named Sicko by Michaela, was an American Eskimo dog they got for her when she was 10, and it was apparently terribly cute. Reference 208 is a German paper from the 40s. I had to dig around a little because I don't speak German, but this paper was apparently the first to talk about the features associated with babies and some animals that we regard as cute and encourage caretaking behaviors. The dog had many nicknames given by the different members of the family. Peterson's included Scumdog, Furball, and Suck Dog. Suck Dog? Suck Dog. The story behind that name is not shared. If you are so inclined, you can find pictures on Instagram at #judgmentalsicko. All this time has been spent on the dog because Peterson doesn't want to fall prey to the minimal group identification, then talks about the experiment behind that. I'm a little confused here because Peterson has his papers coming from Nature, but I'm only seeing it in the Scientific American. Anyways, this paper discusses a couple experiments looking at how people, in this case teens, treat members of artificial in-groups or out-groups. In one experiment, after doing an unbeknownst to them fake task, they were assigned to one of two groups based in their tendency in performing, which was also a cover story, and they were randomly assigned to groups. The actual task was assigning points to people, which would determine how much of a financial reward they walked away from the experiment with. And so you could assign positive points, which would increase the amount of money they got, or negative points, which would decrease the amount of money they got. Most people walked away with about $1, so it's not like they were tons of points or money at stake here, but we can be quite silly about points. The participants didn't know who exactly they were assigning points for. It was just a number, and they didn't have privy to who was what number. But they did know if the person was a member of their group or the other group. One manipulation was in the way the rating boxes were set up. All boxes contained 2 rows of possible point allocations to be used for 2 people. Some boxes were only for in-group members, which they encountered first. Some boxes were only for out-group members, which they encountered second. And some boxes had a row for an in-group member and a row for an out-group member, referred to as the intergroup condition, always seen last. In the strictly in-group or out-group conditions, people were pretty fair in assigning points. But in the intergroup condition, where you were assigning points to somebody in your group or outside of your group, participants gave more points to people who were in their group than not. And this was statistically different than a fair point assignment. This was taken to indicate that participants were discriminating against members of the out-group in that intergroup condition. Why participants didn't just assign high points to everybody, the maximum joint profit strategy, isn't addressed by this experiment. Although it is worth highlighting that assigning positive points to people, in-group or out-group, there was no consequence to you for doing so. But people still weren't likely to just do the maximum joint profit strategy. This effect was replicated in a slightly different task, but Peterson only talks about the first experiment, so we'll stop here. Peterson's discussion of the experiment's method was fair, if missing a little bit of details. But his discussion of their conclusions was missing nuance. Peterson said that participants displayed a marked preference for their own group members, rejecting an egalitarian distribution strategy and disproportionately rewarding those with whom they now identified. But participants were fair up until they were basically reminded about the in-group versus out-group difference. Yeah, they weren't giving maximum points to everybody, but they didn't discriminate against the out-group members when they were only assigning points to those members. Another point in the not quite column. Also, I'm not sure why Peterson included this in a chapter mostly, sort of, about trying to keep your head up and appreciate the good things. The two main things Peterson took from this experiment are that 1, because we like people in our groups, we're social, and 2, because we don't like people not in our groups, we're antisocial. He notes that the why behind these types of behaviors has been debated, but I think this might be the first real opinion hedge of the book. It's that it's a computational simplification, and his example is framed in terms of group size and behavior types. Reference 209 does discuss this general propensity to favor the in-group as a possible way to simplify the calculations in how to treat people of varying group memberships, so that's not coming out of nowhere.
Cooperation is for safety, security, and companionship. Competition is for personal growth and status. However, if a given group is too small, it has no power or prestige and cannot fend off other groups. In consequence, being one of its members is not that useful. If the group is too large, however, the probability of climbing near or to the top declines, so it becomes too hard to get ahead. Perhaps people identify with groups at the flip of a coin because they deeply want to organize themselves, protect themselves, and still have some reasonable probability of climbing the dominance hierarchy. Then they favor their own group, because favoring it helps it thrive. And climbing something that is failing is not a useful strategy.
The timing of going through this book and coincidences with world events has been interesting, talking about sinking ships after the election and all. I noted him indicating his thoughts on this because doing that throughout the book would have alleviated so many of the citations needed through this process. And maybe this is a subtlety I could have conveyed better earlier on, but I have no problem with Peterson speculating, as long as it's clear that that's what he's doing. I'm sure the anthropologists and sociologists are dying a little inside right now, because once again, it's going to be two psychologists talking somewhat out their ass about group dynamics. It doesn't seem right to me that part of group identification and segmentation is about having a shot at the top of the dominance hierarchy. I'd like my YouTube channel to be larger than it is right now, but I don't know if I could handle 1 million subs, let alone however many millions of subscribers the top YouTubers have. I'm having trouble telling the difference between some subscribers at this point, and I'm sure that's only going to get worse. When I taught with a class not quite 200 students, I had trouble telling the difference between the Ashleys, 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 and Ashleys, both online and in person. Back on topic. I think this has more to do with the size of social groups and networks that we can handle. Our social networks tend to be capped to under 200 people in many different contexts, with the average closer to 150. Interestingly, this network size was predicted prior to the existence of most of the data in Table 1. The prediction was based on a model that incorporated primate social network size and the size of their neocortex. This is proposed to be due to the relative stability of primate group membership and needing to keep track of, predict the behaviors of, and bond with group members. Interestingly, the 2020 Dunbar paper states that group living isn't about cooperation, or even Peterson's competition. It's about coordination. To elaborate, coordination involves lots of behaviors to keep the group cohesive and stable, which primates accomplish through lots of bonding. So, not so much on the wanting to sit on top of the dominance hierarchy vibe. So, all of that was to avoid excluding the dog people from this chapter. Pet a friendly animal when you see one on the street was apparently not an option. And that friendly, I think, is kind of important. You don't want to be petting unfriendly animals. That's how you get bit. Or rabies. Then he apologizes to the cat people for possibly excluding them by not talking more about cats, but promises he'll talk more about them later. What comes after petting cute, fluffy things? Suffering, of course.
The idea that life is suffering is a tenet, in one form or another, of every major religious doctrine, as we've already discussed. Buddhists state it directly. Christians illustrate it with the cross. Jews commemorate the suffering endured over centuries. Such reasoning universally characterizes the great creeds because human beings are intrinsically fragile.
For some reason, my mind went to the part of A Clockwork Orange where the main character gets super into reading the Bible because of all the wanton violence. Maybe part of this is what you get out of religion is colored by your beliefs, perceptions, and worldview. So if you want to focus on the inherent goodness of people, you gravitate towards the kind acts described in the stories. If you see violence as a way of life, you gravitate towards the gore. If you see everything as dominance, struggles, and suffering, there you go.
We can be damaged, even broken, emotionally and physically, and we are all subject to the depredations of aging and loss. This is a dismal set of facts, and it is reasonable to wonder how we can expect to thrive and be happy, or even want to exist sometimes, under such circumstances.
I do feel some truth to this. Losing my dad as a teen brought the nature of our terrifyingly fragile and short lives into clear focus. How we deal with that? Peterson's answer is somewhat different than mine. Peterson talks about a former client whose husband was starting to lose a long battle with cancer, and he says they talked about a lot of things, some philosophical, some more real, and in this, he shared his thoughts on human vulnerability with her. Granted, I have limited experience in counseling settings, but is it normal for the counselor to hold the floor as often as Peterson makes it sound like he did? Peterson's son Julian made him acutely aware of how easily we could come to harm, before shifting to talk about Michaela's health problems. And there is a lot of detail provided for this, so we're going to try to just stick to the main points for the gist. She was a happy child, but Peterson's wife Tammy noticed something off in the way she walked, but I guess they didn't really look into it further at that time. When Michaela was 6, her disposition appeared to change. She wasn't the ball of sunshine she'd been before. She was experiencing a lot of pain in her feet that they couldn't really solve. They tried new shoes, they thought maybe it was stress from moving, but it didn't really improve. After getting a referral from a doctor, basically described as being less than helpful in a lot of words, a physiotherapist diagnosed Michaela with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Experiencing a bit of denial about this diagnosis, they sought out alternate opinions who confirmed that diagnosis. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is lumped in with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, involves an autoimmune response leading to inflammation around joints, organs, and nerves. Why this can kick off in childhood is unclear, as is why some kids can grow out of it. But it can result in decreased bone mass.
What sort of God would make a world where such a thing could happen at all, much less to an innocent and happy little girl? It's a question of absolutely fundamental import for believer and non-believer alike.
This question isn't really that fundamental for most atheists. Or rather, the general atheist answer is that there isn't a God, and sometimes life can just be incredibly unfair. Peterson then brings up Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov again, with an exchange between the atheist brother asking the religious brother if he would torture a small child to death in order to bring about a content world, and the religious brother saying he would not. The smiley face is back, with Peterson asking if we remember his son Julian and the snippet he talked about before talking about Michaela's health. He describes going through a process of trying to figure out what he could do to keep Julian from being hurt, taken to some fantastical extremes.
Artificially fortifying Julian would have been the same as destroying him. Instead of his little 3-year-old self, he would be a cold, steel-hard robot. That wouldn't be Julian, it would be a monster. I came to realize through such thoughts that what can be truly loved about a person is inseparable from their limitations. Julian wouldn't have been little and cute and lovable if he wasn't also prone to illness and loss and pain and anxiety. Since I loved him a lot, I decided that he was all right the way he was, despite his fragility.
I don't know what this is like for your own kids, but I did have to grapple with something kind of similar after losing my dad. For a while, I was that girlfriend who could freak out if I didn't hear back from Dr. Mr. the boyfriend. I would absolutely go into an anxiety spiral of maybe he was in a car accident, maybe he was struck by lightning, maybe it was just something bad and random and awful that took him from me. And it took a lot of work for me to get to a point where I could trust that he was doing everything in his power to not die. Having a loved one randomly taken from you changes you, I think. It really emphasizes how much of a crapshoot this all is. One unlucky choice or just moment and you're gone forever. And we can live in fear of that. Be the overly concerned, smothering partner that is afraid to go on adventures. Or we can learn to find the balance. Trust ourselves and those we care about to do the best we can in continuing on living. Go on adventures while managing risk. I've had some amazing experiences just leaving my comfort bubble. And I think the balance I settled on is that these adventures may be the end of me, either in some dramatic fashion or something mundane like a car accident, but at least I tried, and I wasn't just cooped up in my house, afraid. To bring this back to Peterson and his son, I think we've basically arrived at the same ending point, although the window dressing is a bit different. Michaela's quality of life got worse as the disease progressed. She was on a handful of drugs to try to stop the disease from progressing and also reduce the pain. One of these were cortisol shots given under general anesthetic. Chiming in to say that those suck. They have to inject a needle into the joint. No good. I had a couple when I was a teen for bursitis, and I wasn't given an anesthetic. It did help with the bursitis, though. Michaela was given the green light to try etanercept, a drug that's used to prevent joint damage in some forms of arthritis, which worked particularly well when Tammy accidentally gave her 10 times the dose. Whoops. Peterson wanted the 8-year-old Michaela to self-administer the shot, and noted that she'd always been financially motivated. He told her that he would give her $50 if she could administer the shot herself, and it took her something like 30 minutes to build up the nerve to do so, but she did it. The second time he gave her $20, and she did it in 10 minutes. And after that, it was $10 every shot. So, in the parenting chapter, Peterson briefly, it was like a paragraph, touched on positive reinforcement as a parenting technique. And this is 100% positive reinforcement. He's adding a goodie, in this case money, to encourage a behavior in the future, giving herself the shot. Some years pass and Michaela's doing well. The rheumatologist suggests that they try weaning her off the drugs because some kids can outgrow the RA. It became apparent that Michaela was not one of those kids. At some point, it was discovered that her hip joint was just toast and would need to be replaced. Now, back to the client he mentioned earlier. Peterson shared the thoughts about his son and loving people despite their fragility, and the client asked him why this was happening to her and her husband.
My realization of the tight interlinking between vulnerability and being was the best answer I had for her. I told her an old Jewish story, which I believe is part of the commentary on the Torah. It begins with a question, structured like a Zen koan. Imagine a being who is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. What does such a being lack? The answer? Limitation.
Reference to 11 is for part of a Simpsons episode. We skip past the potential philosophical or mathematical set arguments for Peterson's interpretation.
If you are already everything, everywhere, always, there is nowhere to go and nothing to be. Everything that could be already is, and everything that could happen already has. And it is for this reason, so the story goes, that God created man. No limitation, no story. No story, no being. That idea has helped me deal with the terrible fragility of being. It helped my client too. I don't want to overstate the significance of this. I don't want to claim that this somehow makes it all okay. She still faced the cancer afflicting her husband, just as I still faced my daughter's terrible illness. But there's something to be said for recognizing that existence and limitation are inextricably linked.
He then includes part of the Tao Te Ching about the utility of non-existence. I don't know. I don't find much comfort in the idea that we were created explicitly to have limitations. I understand from an evolutionary perspective the necessity of life having a turnover, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. Maybe this is naive, but I feel like I could love something more robust and resilient. And I don't care deeply for my cats because their lives are so short. If anything, that's a con that's outweighed by the many positives of having them in my life. I also don't find much comfort when you start digging into the details of this story. That sometimes our limitations are acute or chronic suffering. Why make us so that we, or even especially kids, can experience intense suffering? Because it leads to being with a capital B? Fuck that. Peterson shifts to talk about the gradual flying brickification of Superman, which led to the character being a bit boring. Flying bricks being a trope of characters that are overpowered and indestructible. One Punch Man played around with this trope, illustrating that an overpowered and indestructible character doesn't always have to lead to boring stories. To combat this potentially fatal to the comic problem, things were added for Superman to struggle against or be weak to. But these became a problem of their own because there was always some last-minute Deus Ex Machina thing for Superman to just win. He was never in any real danger. But a new writer was brought in the 80s, the comic was revamped, and the day was saved.
A superhero who could do anything turns out to be no hero at all. He's nothing specific, so he's nothing. He has nothing to strive against, so he can't be admirable. Being of any reasonable sort appears to require limitation. Perhaps this is because being requires becoming, as well as mere static existence, and to become is to become something more, or at least something different. That is only possible for something limited. Fair enough.
Again, One Punch Man deconstructed this trope by having an interesting story about an practically indestructible, overpowered character. You just have to get creative with the story.
But what about the suffering caused by such limits? Perhaps the limits required by being are so extreme that the whole project should just be scrapped.
I'm not sure if this was intended to be a cultural reference or not, but who can resist incorporating some Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
In the beginning the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
Dostoevsky's work is again referenced, this time Notes from Underground, in addition to Faust, to reinforce this idea that maybe existence is a bit passé. The Columbine boys are included as part of Team Not Existing, before Peterson says that ending one's life is the least terrible outcome from this line of thought. How could a good God allow such a world as this to exist?
Logical, the thoughts of not continuing on and the horrible suffering of existence might be. Understandable, they might be. But there is a terrible catch to such conclusions. Acts undertaken in keeping with them, if not the thoughts themselves, inevitably serve to make a bad situation even worse. Hating life, despising life, even for the genuine pain that life inflicts, merely serves to make life itself worse, unbearably worse. There's no genuine protest in that. There's no goodness in that. Only the desire to produce suffering for the sake of suffering. That is the very essence of evil. People who come to that kind of thinking are one step from total mayhem. Sometimes they merely lack the tools. Sometimes, like Stalin, they have their finger on the nuclear button.
Did you think there wouldn't be a communism doom spiral in a chapter about petting cats? Silly, you know better than that. Why is this doom spiral the only outcome if you don't follow his later alternative? Why do these thoughts lead to acts that make other people suffer too? The Peterson two-box problem, again, of course. Painfully honest pondering time. I sometimes wonder if the empathy and compassion I have for others is, at least in part, because of the suffering I've experienced because of my mood disorder. Like, if I didn't have the depression monster in my head, would I still care for others like I do? I guess my point in sharing that is just to say that suffering and existential pondering doesn't have to inevitably lead to more suffering. Peterson's answer to the horrors of existence is born out of the totalitarian horrors of the last century. Not surprising, given the impetus behind Maps of Meaning. He argues that these existential doubts are morally impermissible,
and I also don't think it's possible to answer the question by thinking. Thinking leads inexorably to the abyss. It did not work for Tolstoy. It might not have even worked for Nietzsche, who arguably thought more clearly about such things than anyone in history. But if it is not thinking that can be relied upon in the direst of situations, what is left? Thought, after all, is the highest of human achievements, is it not? Perhaps not.
Here we go again with the not thinking instructions.
Something supersedes thinking, despite its truly awesome power. When existence reveals itself as existentially intolerable, thinking collapses in on itself. In such situations, in the depths, it's noticing, not thinking, that does the trick.
I would think that noticing would be a type of thinking. Like if you had a Venn diagram of all the different types of thinking, you'd have things like ruminating, planning, and noticing in there. Although, taking a different perspective on this, one technique that you can use if you're in a panic attack or other mental crash is to ground yourself. Basically try to pull yourself out of your head by noticing the stuff around you. Look at 4 things, feel 3 things on your body, identify 2 sounds, and what are you tasting in your mouth? That's not what he's talking about, though.
Perhaps you might start by noticing this when you love someone. It's not despite their limitations, it's because of their limitations.
As a person with limitations, I would hope that people don't love me because of them. Not for the depressive crashes, not for the flare-ups of excruciating pain, not because someday I will die, but love me because of who I am. Likewise, I don't love the people or animals I do because of their limitations. Cleo's progressing kidney disease isn't one of the reasons why I love her. It makes the time I have with her far more precious, but I'd rather her not have it. And now I'm gonna cry.
Of course, it's complicated. You don't have to be in love with every shortcoming and merely accept. You shouldn't stop trying to make life better or let suffering just be. But there appear to be limits on the path to improvement beyond which we might not want to go, lest we sacrifice humanity itself.
I think this is in the context of being requiring limitations and Peterson not being able to love his son if he was robotified. So the limits on improvement are Peterson imposed, as going too far would cause us to lose our limitations, thereby losing being with a capital B. And I don't really agree that the solution to the potential AI problem is to merge ourselves with it before it can destroy us, but I do think that if we can reach a point where we can release ourselves from inherent limitations, I'm game.
Of course, it's one thing to say, being requires limitation, and then to go about happily when the sun is shining and your father is free of Alzheimer's disease and your kids are healthy and your marriage happy. But when things go wrong?
Shifting back to Michaela's story, Peterson says that the pain she was experiencing kept her up at night, and her grandfather, on a visit, gave her some Tylenol 3s, which let her sleep. The rheumatologist, instrumental in producing Michaela's remission, wouldn't give opioids to a teenager and suggested that she just take ibuprofen. Michaela learned then that doctors don't know everything. Ibuprofen for her was a crumb of bread for a starving man. In the middle of some of my own medication drama, I talked about my experiences with trigeminal neuralgia, including difficulties in having my pain taken seriously. In grad school, the nurse at the school's health center assured me that the excruciating pain I was feeling was because of a pimple. They can really hurt, don't you know? During my husband's postdoc abroad, we were never able to get a dedicated healthcare professional, and I didn't have the TN diagnosis yet. In a particularly bad flare-up, like the worst I had experienced to that point, I went to the ER, and the doctor gave me a shot of morphine, and it made the pain just vanish. Later flare-ups and ER visits in the hopes that maybe one of these times I'll be put on the path towards a diagnosis, and they'd suggest that I try taking ibuprofen. The shortest of these was 7 hours of wait, and the longest was 12, of me being put in various waiting rooms because they didn't have enough beds. There were that many people there without doctors. And no, this wasn't the States. And I'd just be sitting there in the uncomfortable chairs, holding my face, trying to keep it together and not just start screaming because I'm in so much pain. And no referral, no, let's look into what's causing you this pain, just, have you tried ibuprofen? I wouldn't say these experiences were like a crumb for someone starving. It was like hitting me with the fucking plate. So I can absolutely relate to this. But I can also understand a doctor's reluctance in prescribing opioids. But I know what it's like to fight for the one thing that makes your chronic pain a little bit more tolerable. Don't tell me to woo my way through pain that makes me want to physically remove part of my face, Brenda.
We talked to a new doctor. He listened carefully. Then he helped Michaela. First, he prescribed T3s, the same medication her grandfather had briefly shared. This was brave. Physicians face a lot of pressure to avoid the prescription of opiates, not least to children. But opiates work. Soon, however, the Tylenol was insufficient. She started taking Oxycontin, an opioid known pejoratively as hillbilly heroin. This controlled her pain, but produced other problems. Tammy took Michaela out for lunch a week after her prescription was started. She could have been drunk. Her speech was slurred, her head nodded. This was not good.
Let's talk about equianalgesics and opioid equivalency. Basically, this is a way to work out how much pain relief you're going to get from different drugs. In this case, the standard is morphine. Roughly, that means that you get 1 unit of pain relief from morphine when taken orally. Regular Tylenol and ibuprofen are less effective analgesics than morphine, taking staggering amounts to get the same effect. Codeine, which is the thing added to Tylenol and T3s, is 1/10 as strong as morphine. Oxycodone, the main player in OxyContin that Michaela was on, or the Percocets I'm on, is a little bit stronger than morphine. For a little added context, medical fentanyl is 50 to 100 times as strong as morphine. I bring this up because going from T3 to OxyContin is a bit of a jump. I'm curious if they didn't get the dosing right. I included this as a quote because it highlights a trend in Peterson's discussion of Michaela's doctors. The current doctor's great until they aren't, and they're replaced by the next great doctor until they aren't, and so forth. So the seeming distrust in established medicine in their talking about Peterson's own recent medication journey and Michaela's lion diet framing is not a new thing. And on some level, I do sympathize. When doctor after doctor doesn't help or sometimes even seem to care, you can get a bit disillusioned with the whole medical profession. But that doesn't mean that I would advocate for people to quit their meds or drastically alter their diet without professional help. Peterson's sister-in-law, a palliative care nurse, suggested that they add Ritalin to the mix, which they did. And it's not clear who prescribed this for her, but the Ritalin did help her with the drowsiness and sedation from the Oxycontin. I know, it's such a minor thing to get hung up on, but I'm kind of curious who prescribed her the Ritalin. I hope it wasn't her aunt. But her condition progressed and her hip seized up again with even more pain. They opted to get her a scooter to let her stay out and about, and Peterson describes this as a lesser danger than taking away her freedom. Michaela's hip was replaced, and she was put in an adult rehabilitation center to recover. And this was not a pleasant experience for her, as most of the other patients were elderly. Her roommate was very neurotic, she couldn't get to sleep at night, and her physiotherapist was on vacation when she got there. The on-duty nurse was highlighted as being particularly unhelpful. From the description, it sounded like Michaela had to be there for some time, but in the following paragraph, Peterson says that she spent 3 days there out of the scheduled 6 weeks.
When the vacationing physio returned, Michaela climbed the rehab center stairs and immediately mastered her additional required exercises. While she was doing that, we outfitted our home with the necessary handrails. Then we took her home. All that pain and surgery, she handled that fine. The appalling rehab center? That produced post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Post-traumatic stress disorder and its symptoms can come about from any number of things. It can be a one-off event, it can be something longer, and what does it for one person might not for somebody else. And I am not going to question Michaela's experience of things. But I am curious if this is coming from Peterson's assessment of her, or if this is from an objective, removed, unbiased mental health professional. Michaela started a motorcycle course a couple months later to be able to keep using her scooter. And apparently they had her training on a full motorcycle, and after seeing somebody else take a really nasty spill on the first day, she was afraid to continue. But Peterson was able to talk her into finishing up the course.
When she received her certificate, everyone else enrolled stood and applauded.
Of course they did.
Then her right ankle disintegrated. Her doctors wanted to fuse the large affected bones into one piece, but that would have caused the other, smaller bones in her foot, now facing additional pressure, to deteriorate. That's not so intolerable perhaps when you're 80, but it's no solution when you're in your teens. We insisted upon an artificial replacement, although the technology was new. There was a 3-year waiting list. This was simply not manageable. The damaged ankle produced much more pain than her previously failing hip. One bad night, she became erratic and illogical. I couldn't calm her down. I knew she was at her breaking point. To call that stressful is to say almost nothing.
Excruciating pain is no joke. At one of the ER visits I mentioned a little bit ago, I couldn't remember my address. I couldn't remember any address I'd ever lived at, even my childhood home, just poof. And in the middle of a flare-up, it can really be tempting to just try to figure out which nerve it is and pull it out. Surely the pain in doing that couldn't be worse than what I'm feeling at that moment. That's not good. Pearson describes researching alternatives to the 3-year wait. Different devices, different countries. Ultimately, they were able to skip the line by going to Vancouver and having it replaced there.
Post-surgery, she was in absolute agony. Her foot was mispositioned. The cast was compressing skin against bone. The clinic was unwilling to give her enough Oxycontin to control her pain. She had built up a high level of tolerance because of her previous use.
Michaela returned home and got off the Oxycontin as it turned her life gray.
She stopped using it as soon as possible. She suffered through withdrawal for months, with night sweating and formication, the sensation of ants crawling upside down under her skin. She became unable to experience any pleasure. That was another effect of opiate withdrawal.
I've talked about withdrawal on the channel before, although usually in the context of benzodiazepines. Although I did once compare it to opiates, just because it is a different process. As such, I won't go through the full withdrawal mechanisms and everything here, so check out this video for the full detailed discussion. The TLDR version is withdrawal can be thought of as your body readjusting to how it functioned before you took the drug. And part of the withdrawal process is you sort of get back what you were taking the drug for. So if you were taking something for anxiety, you can expect rebound anxiety. If you were taking something for pain, you can expect rebound pain. And this also works for side effects too. So a side effect for opioids is constipation. You stop taking the opioid and your bowels will run as free as the Amazon. The main effect of opioids, at least medically, is pain relief. And side effects include things like constipation, constricted pupils, slowed performance, and euphoria. When we're talking about a medication, euphoria is a side effect. Withdrawal from opioids is typically unpleasant, with it described as like a bad flu, but doesn't really have the same risk that withdrawing from benzodiazepines does. Like withdrawing from benzos, if you do it wrong, you might kick off a seizure and possibly die. Withdrawing from an opioid wrong typically involves vomiting and then inhaling that and suffocating. Withdrawal starts 6 to 12 hours after the last dose, peaks at roughly a day to 3 days post that dose, and tends to be over within a week. However, it does appear that anhedonia, a general lack of pleasurable experience, can last much longer. From my absolutely not medical opinion and somewhat limited psychopharmacology experience, I wouldn't expect profuse sweating to last into the months. And I'm also finding mixed results for formication resulting from opioid withdrawal. Wikipedia and some general health websites say sure, but medical and psychopharmacology textbooks, not so much. I've typically heard about this occurring with stimulant use. So some nicknames for this experience are things like coke or crank bugs, because if you use cocaine or amphetamines, you can experience this. She was on Ritalin for some unspecified period of time. And Ritalin is a stimulant. Anyways, for all of this though, you don't necessarily have to go cold turkey on the medication. There are other medications you could be put on or switched to make the withdrawal process less harsh. Talk to your healthcare provider. You don't have to go this alone. However, the Petersons apparently have a track record of trying to bootstrap themselves out of these situations, so those may not have been seen as an option. Peterson offers up the things they learned in this experience. 1. Have a set time period to talk and think about the illness or disease every day. This includes things like managing it or medication discussion. Do not engage with it outside that time window. This is to allow you to allocate resources to things outside that condition. If something pops up outside the time window, it'll just have to wait. 2. Shift the unit of time you use to frame your life. Matthew 6:34 and the Sermon on the Mount are provided as support for planning for the future in a way that makes sense given your current context. 3. Presume the primary goodness of being. This includes stuff about aiming high and aligning with the heavens. 4. Put your life in order where you can. And 5. In order to persevere, you have to see the good in being. As he explains, if you lose that, you are truly lost. Ruminating over something like this probably is a bad idea, so giving yourself a set period of time to think about and talk about and focus on it does make some sense. I'm less sure about not dealing with things that pop up outside of that time window, though. Sometimes you just have to deal with things as they happen. Likewise, accepting that you can't plan out as far into the future as you might like in the middle of a crisis, especially a health crisis, makes sense. Burying it in biblical discussion, less so. If we distill the remaining points down into staying on top of your life and responsibilities as much as you can and focusing on the positive, it's not bad advice. But there is some lost in the distillation process. Peterson describes dogs as being like people, and all-around good boys who are happy at the bottom of the family's dominance hierarchy. Then he says his piece on cats.
Cats, however, are their own creatures. They aren't social or hierarchical, except in passing. They are only semi-domesticated. They don't do tricks. They are friendly on their own terms. Dogs have been tamed, but cats have made a decision. They appear willing to interact with people for some strange reasons of their own. To me, cats are a manifestation of nature, of being, in an almost pure form. Furthermore, they are a form of being that looks at human beings and approves.
Our Calico really seemed to act like she thought she was a person who was constantly being denied her rights. Why doesn't she get to eat the pizza with us? Why doesn't she get to use a computer? Meow, 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 meow. Cats are social animals, food permitting. Groups of cats, called colonies, tend to be matrilineal. Members will have preferred associates, basically little kitty friends, touch noses to say hi, and play with and groom each other. Females will apparently also act as a midwife to cats giving birth and help with birth-related cleanup, babysitting, and even bringing food to the new mom. Mating is polygamous, with success being linked to the social attachments present between the female and males. Larger groups of cats can have a complicated hierarchy, with fighting typically being averted through body language. Having dominant status may only impart some benefit in things like food access, though. Cats are referred to as semi-domesticated, though, as opposed to like dogs who are fully domesticated. Interestingly, there is some debate if we were the ones to sort of domesticate them, or if cats domesticated themselves. Cats can do all sorts of tricks. There wouldn't be cats in TV or movies if this wasn't the case. Finally, calling cats a manifestation of being kind of suggests to me that Peterson hasn't really lived with cats. They're agents of chaos. And gravity testers. Peterson details some scenarios for when you meet a cat on the street.
If I see a cat at a distance, for example, the evil part of me wants to startle it with a loud sound, front teeth over bottom lip. That will make a nervous cat puff up its fur and stand sideways so it looks larger. Maybe I shouldn't laugh at cats, but it's hard to resist. The fact that they can be startled is one of the best things about them, along with the fact that they are instantly disgruntled and embarrassed by their overreaction.
Dick. Of course, he would see potential jumpiness as a best feature. Or he can try to get the cat to come over for some pets and it runs away. Or he can try to get the cat to come over and it just ignores him because cat. Or you can try to get the cat to come over, and it does, and receives some lobstery love. A neighbor Siamese is described as being low in the big 5 trait of neuroticism, and is generally a pretty chill cat, even with dogs. So sometimes they'll come over and visit with their dog, or sometimes they'll just come over to say hi to the Petersons. Peterson encourages the reader to find little sources of joy on bad days. His distraction of choice is apparently watching The Simpsons at 1.5 speed.
And maybe when you're going for a walk and your head is spinning, a cat will show up, and if you pay attention to it, then you will get a reminder for just 15 seconds that the wonder of being might make up for the ineradicable suffering that accompanies it. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street.
Overall, the advice of focusing on the positive when life is going pear-shaped is alright. The framing of needing to do this lest you think yourself into nihilistic doom is sus though. This chapter ends with a postscript on Michaela's condition. Remember that this book was published in 2018. For some reason, her artificial ankle was going to have to be removed and they would fuse the bones as initially suggested. And Peterson notes that she was in pain since the replacement surgery with limited mobility on that joint. Enter a new, large, powerful, attentive physiotherapist from London who was able to fix her ankle by compressing it for 40 seconds while she moved her foot back and forth. A mispositioned bone slipped back where it belonged. Her pain disappeared. In Michaela's podcast with her father, towards the beginning of it, they mentioned that she was in Zurich having invasive surgery done on her foot. I guess this means that the London physiotherapist wasn't quite a miracle worker after all. Alrighty, let's roll the piss takes and unlobstered life advice into one process here. You are a dog or a cat person because of group dynamics and hierarchical aspirations. People can be strange about group membership and how we treat members of other groups. This doesn't mean that we have to do that, though. Be mindful of how you're treating others. You can only love something or someone because you may lose them. As stated earlier, I'm more on the side of loving in spite of the possibility of loss, not because of the possibility of loss. Love because you love, for whatever traits you like or enjoy or whatever, because you love them, not because you're going to lose them. In either case, those you love could be taken from you at any moment. Time with them is precious. Plan for bad things during good times. I will agree with Peterson that it is important to give yourself time and space away from negative life situations. Try to maintain some sense of normalcy by sticking to routines and organization and all of that, and to focus on the positive. You don't need the Bible to tell you that, though. Peterson doesn't really know cats, and the current healthcare provider is great until they can no longer fix his daughter. Cats aren't strictly lone predators. They can actually be quite social. Devaluing people, in this case healthcare professionals, because they go from useful to not useful just because they're staying the course on the treatment that they had been providing, probably isn't useful. Some doctors are bad doctors. I've had my share, but they've generally been consistent in their badness. If your doctor is unwilling to pursue more aggressive or untested treatment than what you want, and you're able to find a doctor who is willing to do those things, as long as you understand the risks that you're potentially undertaking in doing so, have at. But that original doctor shouldn't be thrown in the shitty bin because they didn't want to do the treatment that you wanted. All that being said though, caveat emptor. If a doctor is willing to do whatever treatment at the right price, be careful. Do your research. Know what you're getting into. So, big picture, gist messages of this chapter. Take time to appreciate the good things in life, even if they are little good things, and treasure the time you have with those you love. Not so bad as far as these rules go, but again, once you get down into the details, it gets a little bit muddy. And bam! We managed to do this rule in one video. It's been a while, although it does help that this chapter was kind of short, so it wasn't entirely my doing. Anyways, that's it for this video. See you guys next time. Bye!